Who do you think China wants to win the next presidential election?
Well, I think China sees some challenges either way, because for the most part, it's not really about who the nominee or the candidate is that comes out on top. The American people's views have changed dramatically over the last 4+ years, arguably over the last 8 years. President Trump is a known, as former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld might say. So they know he'll seek dialogue and negotiations in some ways, but he'll be firm on deterrence and was strong with allies like Japan and others during his first term, and that would be continuity. For Kamala Harris, she has much less of a record for what her foreign policy priorities would be. She hasn't really made very many pronouncements of broad strategy towards China. I would assume she would seek continuity with the Biden approach, but there's a lot to be filled in. So China might prefer a little bit of the possibility of the old establishment way of thinking about engagement, if that's where Kamala Harris goes, over the disruptive unknowns of Donald Trump.
Do you think that Harris has shown herself to be a competent politician when it comes to dealing with foreign adversaries? Do you think that China could take advantage perhaps of her inexperience in foreign policy?
Well, obviously, the Chinese spend a lot of time and resources studying our political personalities. They have almost unlimited resources and personnel to try to manipulate and game us. And they do that with all world leaders they engage, American and otherwise. And so they'll come prepared with an attempt to try to push her in what they would see as a more calm and steady approach to them, which means fewer challenges. Her record as vice president and before that as senator really has not been deep on foreign affairs. She seems anxious, scripted on the world stage, which is understandable if you don't have that kind of experience. But now she's being thrust into a very unsettled world with challenges in Europe, Middle East, Asia, and elsewhere. Not a lot of time for on-the-job training, and I think that there's a concern about that lack of fortitude and experience on her part.
How do you think that meeting with Xi would go with Kamala Harris? How would she be able to cope with that?
Well, the Chinese are masters of just having meetings that are exchanges of talking points in public, and there'll be a few comments behind the scenes. But then it's a test of what one does. They take the measure of actions much more than words. They expect you to follow their script with the magic words they've tried to impose on the English-speaking world. But really, it comes down to, will she press on trade? Will she press for accountability on COVID and fentanyl? Will she push for a deterrence in East Asia, especially as they've encroached upon not just Taiwan, but Korea, Japan, the Philippines, others in the South China Sea? These are different terms of engagement now. And so her hands will be full. She'll have to push with actions before her words will be respected.
And when it comes to President Trump, do you think that he will attempt to reconcile with China, or will he sort of go down the path of protectionism and so on as he did in 2016?
Well, I think President Trump is fairly a known quantity at this point. He obviously is someone willing to engage in direct dialogue with world leaders, friends and foes alike. And with him, engaging in dialogue doesn't mean concession. It means he's ready to engage and shape the information environment for negotiation. And so that happened with China before on trade, but it's happened with China on deterrence too. He had that famous interaction that wasn't directly China related, but it was Xi Jinping sitting down for chocolate cake. Well, Trump, unannounced, launched cruise missiles into Syria, killing Russians. That left an impression on Xi Jinping, and there was, I think, this kind of cold rapport of shaping out some other negotiations going forward. But China was less aggressive during that period until we got to the COVID outbreak. We'll see where it goes from here. But Trump, I think, is someone who will engage in negotiation for sure, will seek to lessen tensions, but he's also going to be strong in support of deterrence with our allies.
Are you concerned about Chinese election interference in this cycle?
Well, I think we have to be clear about the notion of that being a problem. Frankly, I think most Americans are more concerned about other Americans and institutions engaging in manipulation. I mean, the effect of searching just about the attempted assassination of Donald Trump coming up with null sets of results or shifting over to Kamala Harris's information is, I think, a greater concern than what China might do. But it's there, whether it's TikTok or other kinds of platforms. The plus side is I think a lot of Americans are onto this. Is it sufficient? Not to my liking, but it's way more than it was in 2016 and 2020 in terms of Americans being aware of this manipulation and problem.
Does China use social media like TikTok as a kind of political weapon against the US? And if so, how?
It uses every tool at its disposal. I mean, it uses an open border to flood toxins into our country. My daughter is among the 300,000+ victims of fentanyl poisoning in the last 4 years. They use these tools of manipulation to undermine the generation that should be driving our economy, filling the ranks of our volunteer military, and otherwise competing with the likes of China. So, of course, manipulation includes trying to shape outcomes in elections, but more strategically, beyond the election, it's dumbing down and disrupting the 20 to 40-year-old generation of Americans. And I think they have been lethally successful in that in recent years. But again, I think more Americans are aware of it. Hopefully our leaders will support approaches that protect us against those kinds of malign influences.
Are China trying to take advantage of Joe Biden's final months as president, seeing as, to many people he just seems too old for the job?
Well, conspicuously, when Prime Minister Netanyahu was visiting the United States, Joe Biden had a relatively brief public meeting with the visiting prime minister, and then the vice president had a meeting, and she gave the press response afterwards. That seems to reinforce the notion that an untested vice president is already acting president. And so there's kind of this combination where if you're an aggressor, you might look to this next 6 months as a window to seek advantage. I hope that's not how our adversaries are going to act for the sake of America or interest in our allies for that matter. But I'm quite concerned that that impression is real.
Are you concerned about war in Taiwan over the next few years? Do you think that the next president will have to face that terrible decision as to whether the US will intervene if China invades?
Well, honestly, I have faced this kind of a question and a challenge for most of the 30+ years that I've been coming and going to Asia, serving in and out of government. It feels more visceral and real now than it ever has in times past. That includes in 1996 when there were missile tests with splashdown zones near Taiwan during their presidential election. We have much greater numbers of military sorties and civilian crafts that are pressuring and encircling Taiwan today than ever before. And so the threat, the risk, seems much more real now. I would say that I would not expect the people of Taiwan to take it passively. I do not think that they are a very easy population to conquer and control. And if there's an ounce of rationality in Beijing, and there may not be, they didn't have to do what they did to Hong Kong after all, but if there's an ounce of rationality, they should be humble about this. The Japanese controlled Taiwan for 50 years as a colony, and Taiwanese identity came out intact. The KMT dictatorship imposed martial law for 25 years, and the Taiwanese identity came out intact. This is a tough group of people to control and govern over time, and so they might have a flashy pressure attack or even an invasion. That would be a travesty, but I would not give them good odds over time. History is not on their side in this regard.
Steve Yates, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.